Hello and welcome. This is another motorcycle video. In the last one I talked to you about some things I didn't like about my Spyder, and I think I've covered a lot of things to do with that in the last few videos, so I thought I'd talk about something else today. And for a moment I was sort of stumped about, well, what could I talk about? And then I read an article in the newspaper and checked it with a couple of other sources to make sure it wasn't some sort of G-up. And it gave me the inspiration for what I'd like to talk about today. And the gist of the story is that Mickey Dolenz, and I will explain who Mickey Dolenz is in a moment. Mickey Dolenz is suing the FBI. Now, Mickey Dolenz is the only surviving member of an American pop group. We used to call them pop groups in those days, back in the 60s, called the Monkees. And he's suing the FBI because the FBI apparently kept a file on this group in the 1960s. And keep in mind here that the group was only really a big group for about 2 years, from 66 through to 68. They did play on after that, and they did have several reunions, but their big years were between about 66 and 68. And for some reason the FBI took a particular interest in this group and kept a file on them. Now in 2011, an application was made to have the file released, and the FBI released parts of the file, but much of it was heavily redacted. So Dolenz then made applications under Freedom of Information and various administrative instruments that he could use to have the rest of the file released. The FBI declined to release the file, so he is now taking them to court with the idea of trying to have the full unredacted file released. Now I want you to keep in mind here that Mickey Dolenz himself is 77. The group, the Monkees, there were 4 members of it. The other 3 members are dead. And the last of those was Mike Nismith, who died aged 78 last year in 2021. Peter Tork died in 2018, and Davey Jones died in 2012 or thereabouts, I think, aged 66. So the events we're talking about were events that took place over 50 years ago. Now, to give you a bit of background, first of all, for those who don't know who the Monkees are or why it's of any interest, let me give you that history lesson first of all. From about 1962 onwards, a couple of fellows in the television production industry named Bob Rafelson and Don Kirshner had been trying to pitch the idea of making a TV show which would essentially be a sitcom about 4 young men who were in a pop group and all sorts of zany adventures that they had. Now, when Beatlemania and everything that went with that, including the British invasion, and I'll explain that again at that term in a moment, became a huge phenomenon in England, a production house called Screen Gems decided to go with the idea and to produce the show. And so the show was produced in 1966, and I think it ran for 2 seasons and was cancelled in 1968. Now, to go back to the term the British invasion, from about 1964, when the Beatles first toured the United States, there were a host of British bands, including the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, the Searchers, the Animals, Herman's Hermits, Cherry and the Pacemakers, the Hollies. In fact, you name any British band that was around in the early to mid 60s, or even the late 60s, and they all had a go at the American market. They'd made it successfully in the British market, but the money was in England, in the United States, so they went to the United States to make the big time and make money. Now, at that time, about the only big band in the a big group in the United States would have been the Beach Boys, who were already suffering and fading away a little bit because Brian Wilson had been experiencing some mental health issues, and his creative juices had dried up. So the television production company decided that they would make this TV show about these 4 guys who were in a group, and they had all sorts of zany adventures. The 4 people in the group were Davey Jones, who was from England. He was actually from Manchester, which I suppose for Americans was close enough to Liverpool to be acceptable, although it's not, and Mankewians would not, and Liverpudlians would both be angry if you tried to put the 2 things together. But he was from Manchester. He was an actor, and in fact I think I read somewhere that he'd either received a Tony Award or a nomination for a Tony Award for his successful portrayal in Oliver. The other actor was Mickey Dolenz himself, who'd been in a TV show called Circus Boy, about a boy in a circus, and his claim to fame was riding around on an elephant. That show was cancelled when he reached about 15 and looked gawky and could no longer pass off as a young child. The other two in the band were Mike Nismith, who was a musician from Texas, and he'd had a bit of success in songwriting in that he'd written a few songs and recorded them for local labels, but he also wrote a song called Different Drum, which was recorded by a group called the Stone Ponies, whose lead singer at the time was Linda Ronstadt. And the other fourth member of the band was a bloke called Peter Tork that had come to the West Coast where the show was filmed from New York and the folk scene. The folklore is that Peter Tork was recommended to the producers of the show by another luminary of the West Coast sound, that is Stephen Stills, who apparently auditioned for the show and was unsuccessful. I feel certain it wasn't because of his musicianship. And as we know, Stills had been successful with Buffalo Springfield and several other bands, and then later on with Crosby, Stills and Nash, and then later on Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young and several other bands. Anyhow, so this group was put together. The idea was that the production company and the two fellows that created the show would have total control over almost every aspect of the show. They controlled the name, they controlled the image of the group, they controlled the music, they controlled everything to do with this group. And almost from the beginning that grated with Mike Nesmith in particular, and at points throughout the show he sort of agitated for more creative control, for more input, for more decisions about what songs could be recorded and for hands-on production and so on. And at every turn he was denied by the producers, to the point where one of the episodes was filmed without him because he threatened to quit the group and leave the show. In the early days, the recordings that were made for the show and by the group, many session musicians were used, and that's not unusual. Lots of groups had session musicians used to refine their sound, and in fact everyone probably well knows now that the Beach Boys, in fact, Brian Wilson used session musicians more often than he used the other members of the group because he felt they couldn't play what he was hearing in his head. So anyhow, the producers of the show had say over what songs would be recorded, and they employed some staff writers and other writers to write songs that the group would then record. Two fellows named Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart wrote a number of songs for them, and their first song they recorded, Last Train to Clarksville, was written by that pair. That pair negotiated a deal that said, well, if we write some songs for the Monkees and they're successful, we ought to get a recording contract, and they did. And they had a couple of hits with a song called You Are Still My Favourite Girlfriend, Alice Long, and another called I Wonder What She's Doing Tonight. Carole King's Pleasant Valley Sunday was also recorded by the Monkees, and Neil Diamond wrote several songs that the Monkees recorded, including I'm a Believer, It's a Little Bit Me, It's a Little Bit You, and Look Out, Here Comes Tomorrow. Now, bearing all that in mind and keeping in mind if you know any of those songs and those particular writers, they're all fairly, I would say, sweet, innocent, lovely sing-along poppy tunes that everybody could like. Your parents in those days could like the Monkees because they were four clean-cut, three All-American boys and one English boy. They didn't have opinions, and if they had opinions, they never expressed them, and no one cared what they thought about anything. They never had to apologise for saying things like "We're bigger than Jesus." They weren't thought of as surly and scruffy like the Rolling Stones, and so they were likeable. Your parents liked them, and teenage girls in particular loved them. Apparently, the FBI became interested in them because they felt that there were either subversive messages or subliminal messages in some of their songs, and decided to start a file on them. Now, one of their songs, and I mentioned it earlier, is called Last Train to Clarksville, which, as I said, was written by Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart. And when you listen to the song, initially it's about a bloke telling his girlfriend to get the last train from Clarksville and meet her at the station and have a good time, and then something's happening because he doesn't know if he's ever going to see her again, because he says he doesn't know if he's ever coming home. Decades later, I don't mean a few years later, I mean decades later, Tommy Boyce said that he wanted to write an anti-war song, but he didn't want to get into too much trouble over it, so he did his best to disguise his anti-war feelings. And the idea of the young man saying he doesn't know if he's ever coming home was because he'd got his draft notice, and he was being sent off to military training prior to being sent to Vietnam. So you could understand why he thought he wasn't ever going to come home. But aside from that, most of the songs that the Monkees recorded were fairly innocuous things. Bear in mind that Bob Dylan had written Times They Are A-Changin' and Blowing in the Wind and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, and With God on Our Side. Barry Maguire had recorded The Eve of Destruction. Eric Burdon had recorded sometime around that time Sky Pilot. These guys are singing about I'm a Believer and things like that. The FBI decided to keep a file on them. Now, what I was curious about it in the article, and I read just another article that said that FBI agents went to their shows and took notes. Keep in mind, of course, back in those days, this is the 60s, there are no mobile phones, there are no digital cameras, so anyone's taking photos have got to use flash photography and film. And I'm wondering if the FBI are sending off the lyric sheets to some laboratory and parsing them to see which words are subversive, which words are not allowed, and so on. But, you know, it appears that the FBI agents bought tickets to the show and sat there and listened to the shows and watched the images and watched saw the posters and so on, took notes, and a file was created on these 4 men. I think there are some really interesting questions to be raised here. The first of which is, well, okay, aside from going to the shows, how else did the FBI gather any information that's in this file that they refused to release about these 4 young men? In other words, was their mail monitored? Were their phones tapped? Or any of these? Now, I'm not saying they were or they weren't. I'm asking that question because the file is heavily redacted. We don't know whether there was anything subversive, but as far as we know, these are 4 law-abiding citizens, 4 clean-cut, squeaky clean young men who your mother and father could like, and whose only thing was to make some music in a country where the right of free speech is guaranteed, apparently. So we wonder what sort of resources the FBI put into compiling this file. But the more important thing is, another important thing, perhaps not the most important thing, but another important thing is, were there other sources of information? Were there other people who were either paid informants for the FBI, or were people who considered themselves patriots of some sort, who decided that these 4 young men were subversive and were undermining the morality of young impressionable teenagers, and therefore ought to be reported upon? If there were paid informants, who were they? How much were they paid? How do we know that the information that they supplied that's in this file that no one's allowed to read was accurate? But the bigger question is this, and I should say at this stage, the articles that I read, and I read this information in a number of news sites, so not just one, but a number of news sites. There was no mention as to say whether the wives or surviving children or estates of the other 3 members of the group were supporting Dolan's in this particular action he was taking against the FBI. So it may be personally an action he's taking and the others are not supporting. We don't know, or they don't know about, or they don't care about. And I understand and accept that they, all 3 of them, might have reputations that they want to protect. But the big question here is, this all happened, as I said, between about 1966 and 1968 was about the peak period for the success of the Monkees. So it's over 50 years ago. What secrets are there that the FBI feel need to be protected now, nearly 50 years later, or over 50 years later? 3 members of the group are dead. The other guy is in his late 70s, as far as we know, in good health, but like any 70-year-old, is not as spry as he was when he was in the group in 1966. Maybe having some memory issues. I don't know. I'm not saying he is or he isn't, but you can assume that a person who's in their 70s sometimes might have an odd memory issue. So the question is this: what secrets, if any, are the FBI protecting in something that happened over 50 years ago, that they cannot now or will not now release this file in full and let this guy read what it is that's been written about him and have the opportunity to challenge it or set the record straight or find out who said what about him and when, or who said what about the other members of the group and when it was said and why and under what circumstances and what context and so on, assuming that everybody can remember all of that information. It's inconceivable to me that any investigation or any source might be compromised by this information being revealed. After all, if, as I said, Mickey Dolenz is 77, Mike Nismith died last year, he was 78, Peter Tork was well into his 70s when he died, any source that was providing information to the FBI about these four men would presumably be at least the same age, if not older. If Mark Felt, who was, I believe at the time, an assistant director at the FBI, could reveal himself or out himself as deep throat in the Watergate scandal, then surely any sources who were providing the FBI with information about these four young men who were just making music, remember, just making music. They weren't making political statements. They weren't telling the world they were bigger than Jesus. They weren't recording things like "With God on Our Side" or "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." They weren't recording songs like "The Eve of Destruction." They weren't recording songs like "Street Fighting Man." They were recording songs like "It's a Little Bit Me, It's a Little Bit You." What secrets could possibly be hidden or need to be kept hidden that can't now be revealed and allow this fellow to find out what it is the FBI had to say about him and why. Now, to sort of conclude this discussion then, the Monkees show was cancelled because Mike Nismith became extraordinarily difficult as far as the producers of the show were concerned, and they thought, rather than we're not going to acquiesce to this guy, we're not going to give him what he wants, so we'll just cancel the show. Don Kirshner, it's alleged, started another TV show called The Archies, and you might remember there was a band called The Archies that had a couple of hits. I think one of them was called Sugar Sugar, and his argument was it was much easier to work with cartoon characters than it was to work with real people. Bob Rafelson went on to work with Jack Nicholson and Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda on a movie called Easy Rider. At one point the Monkees tried to produce a movie following in the footsteps of the Beatles, who'd done, of course, A Hard Day's Night and Help. Their movie was called Head, and it was a bit of a psychedelic mess. And apparently Jack Nicholson, for some reason, was brought in to provide some direction to the script and so on, and he brought his mate Bob Rafelson, Bob Rafelson worked on the film, tried to work on the film, and brought in his mate Jack Nicholson, and then they went off, as I said, to work on the film Easy Rider. When the show was cancelled, the band struggled on for a little while, but without the exposure of TV, the recording contracts lapsed, and they toured for a little while, but then I think they officially dissolved broke up in about 1970, although, as I said, I think their peak years were about 66 to 68. It's said in some of the information that I read about them that they were the most successful band ever in terms of the fact they had 4 number-1 albums in 1 year, and that certainly outdoes any other band either then or since. They had a number of reunions. Sometimes Mike Nismith participated in those reunions and other times he didn't. A relative of his, I'm not sure if it was his mother or his aunt or somebody that was a relative of his, invented liquid paper. And he, which is that white correcting fluid that you used to use to correct typing mistakes before we all had computers. And so he inherited the fortune that went with that. The other guys sort of did things together. Dolenz went on to be a record producer more than anything, and Davey Jones did guest spots on many shows and acting, and Peter Tork had a bit of a mixed career of issues to do with substance abuse and so on. All right, well, I think I've pretty well covered all the issues I want to talk about in this video, so something a bit different, instead of talking about the motorcycle. I hope you enjoyed the scenery while you were listening to me talk about this particular incident. And I'll say goodbye. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something and enjoyed the scenery, and I will talk to you again when I'm preparing another video about something that I hope will be of interest to you.